Hey, welcome back to yet another great episode of This Week in Christian History. And today's episode is centered around an event that happened on June the 11th, 1936, which is the founding of what will be known as the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And so in America, and we'll learn a heck of a lot more about all of those moving parts. So John Muether is with us. He is a professor of church history at the Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, and also runs all of the, or looks over, how about that, all of the libraries throughout all the campuses for RTS. So, John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, fantastic. Well, this is, for some people who are not Presbyterian, and quite frankly, probably some people who are Presbyterian might not be aware of all of these different iterations that were all of these different conferences and these different associations and different types of membership. And, one of the things that we talk about here when we're doing our at our Center for Christian History is we don't spend a whole lot of time trying to really talk more about specific doctrine or theology. We're talking much more about history, but on an occasion where doctrine and theology are making part of the history, right? We certainly want to be able to talk about that. So why don't you, if you will, just kind of start us off about what was going on and what led to the date, at least, that we are kicking around and discussing today.
Sure. The story of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church is part of the broader picture of what many call the split peas of American Presbyterianism.
Right.
If you've seen charts of the history of American Presbyterianism, you see a convoluted set of unions and divisions, and the OPC is part of that big picture. The roots of the OPC go back to the so-called fundamentalist modernist controversy of the early 20th century. And it's important to bear in mind that while this controversy shook up all of American Protestantism, it had its most public and vitriolic battles in Northern Presbyterianism. Wow. And that modifier is important because we must remember that American Presbyterianism was divided north and south from the Civil War all the way until 1983, wow, which is when the southern and northern portions of the mainline Presbyterian Church reunited. With the early in the fundamentalist modernist controversy, liberals were denying what conservatives thought were the essentials. Some called them the fundamentals of the faith, including the inspiration and authority of Scripture, the virgin birth of Christ, his miracles, his bodily resurrection, and the like. And in the wake of that controversy, Machen published, J. Gresham Machen, a professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, which at the time was the conservative holdout from this gradual slide towards liberalism. He published the book Christianity and Liberalism in 1923. That's a book that 3 years ago was honored across in many contexts at the centennial of its publishing. Oh. And that book, as the title suggested, Christianity and Liberalism, Machen was positing that these are two different things. Liberalism is not a variant of Christianity. Liberalism is something altogether different from historic Christian teaching. This was a very influential book that galvanized many voices in conservatism. Machen argued that liberalism was not liberal in the classic sense of the word.
Mm.
It wasn't modern. It was as old as the hills, it said. It wasn't scientific as much as it claimed it was. It was rather, and most of all, it was not even Christian. It couldn't be said Christian. Um, and he goes throughout this book to demonstrate on all the basic doctrines of Christianity, liberalism is found to be wanting. And it primarily misses the grace of the gospel. Machen said that liberalism is altogether written in the imperative mood. Liberalism is a religion that teaches good people to continue to be good people, whereas Christianity is a religion of the broken heart.
Mm.
It's how God redeems a sinful people. It's a gospel of grace, not a gospel of pride or a gospel of works. Now, as the controversy heated up in the Northern Presbyterian Church, the focus by the end of that decade of the 20s fell on a couple of things. First of all,
You mean the 1920s?
1920s, correct.
Right,
Thank
right.
you.
And so when you're talking about that was the group, it was called literally the Northern Presbyterian Church of America, or what was the name of the
the technical name was the Presbyterian Church USA.
Okay.
In the South,
Not to be confused with today's USA, or
well,
I'm getting ahead of myself.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. I guess the technical name was the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America.
Okay.
At the same time, there's another church called the Presbyterian Church in the United States,
Huh.
and that was the Southern Church. See,
Okay.
this is the split peas here.
Yeah, yeah.
I tell students that all this confusion is job security for historians because someone's got to be around to explain it. So there's a concern about Princeton Seminary, one of the seminaries of the Northern Presbyterian Church,
Mm-hmm.
and the General Assembly, under the influence of progressive voices, determines to alter the board structure of Princeton, and that puts modernists on the board of the seminary. In 1929, Machen views this as the end of the seminary's witness in faithfulness to Scripture in the Westminster Confession. So he leaves and he takes some colleagues with him, and he forms Westminster's Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Then the crisis in the church falls towards the Foreign Missions Board of the church, where it is notoriously funding voices that are not Orthodox, even voices that are even non-Christian. I mean, a very prominent example was that the PCUSA, the Northern Church, was funding the labors of Pearl Buck, an anthropologist and a novelist, excuse me, who wasn't a believer in her work in China, in other parts of Asia. And in response to this, Machen leads into the formation of the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions, an alternative board that will ensure its missionaries are preaching the gospel on foreign soil.
Is that where Louisa Lee was one of those that? Did she send a name? Okay, another episode for another day.
Okay.
There were excuse me, a couple of. We have one in our Christian history today that is we focused on who left, who was a missionary in India, and and she left the PCUSA and because of it being too liberal. Right. And then went back to this other.
Okay, she may have numbered among them. Well, the the modernists in the Presbyterian Church pursued ecclesiastical charges against Machen for disloyalty to its boards. Now, here's an interesting footnote to this story that just took place a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
The Presbyterian Church in the USA, the mainline church, closed its mission board.
wow.
It folded it into another organization, but their missionaries are now called ecumenical liaisons or something like this,
Huh.
who are going to
Okay.
respect the interfaith connections they have with religions internationally. So, in other words, there's no longer a board of foreign missions that Machen was disloyal to
Okay.
anymore. And that just happened a couple of weeks ago.
Wow. Okay.
Now, and because Machen was convicted of disloyalty and he was defrocked, his ministerial credentials were suspended, and that was true of him and a few other colleagues of his. And in response to that, they formed the Presbyterian Church of America. And the date of that formation was, as you said, June 11, 1936. Now, and this was this was a departure that would lead to the church that would change its name a few years later. We'll get to that, to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. It was a small departure of only 5,000 members out of a 2 million member church.
Wow.
And those numbers discouraged Machen. He was hoping that he would convince more of his cause. And I think the reason, one explanation for the small numbers that exited had to do with the readers of his book, Christianity and Liberalism. There were basically three parties among the ministerial membership of the Northern Presbyterian Church. There was a small group of dedicated modernists who were promoting progressive views of Christianity. There were also conservatives. Some were labeled fundamentalists. Machen didn't like the word fundamentalist, but he once said, if by fundamentalist you mean somebody who is opposed to modernism, then I am a fundamentalist of the various sort.
Okay.
But it wasn't a term of his choosing. But the vast majority of the ministerial membership were moderates. And Machen's book tried to galvanize them to see the importance of this cause. In fact, the very last chapter in his book, Christianity and Liberalism, is on the church. And he makes the point there that these vast differences between liberalism and historic Christianity are such that the differences have ecclesiastical consequences. Well, Machen, by and large, failed to rally those moderates to join him. Many thought their churches were conservative, and they thought they had a calling to stay in. They sympathized with Machen theologically, but they didn't see to going with him follow his ecclesiological consequences.
Well,
So it was a small number that pulled out.
let me ask you real quick, if I may. Okay,
Sure.
First off, everyone, we are enjoying our conversation with John Muether, who is professor of church history at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, and we are talking about the development of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church that got its ultimate start on June 11th, 1936. So, what was it? Were there congregations that were maybe going back to their pastor who might have been, maybe more moderate and going, we need to get out of here and go join up? Or was it some that also or said, no, we don't need to do that way? Or was it some that just felt like, hey, the way to really kind of change this thing and really be able to move it the right way is stay in. We need to stay in and continue the push and the pull, if you will, of the fight, and not as a bad of a term as we might think about it, but in that discussion, yeah, we get you. We're with you on the theological pieces, but taking our toys and going home is not the way to be able to change that. We need to stay in it and be able to change it that way. Was some of that going on, or was it?
Yes, certainly there was. There were different assessments of the struggle and the most effective biblical response to it.
Okay.
There was an economic factor here that bears noting too. The consequence of anyone pulling out, any minister pulling out, was to lose completely the pension that you've been building. So one of the consequences is that the leadership the ministers who would leave with Machen were rather of the young age, young
Okay.
ministers who hadn't built this up, and that was a very difficult cost to have to bear.
Sure.
That there were some who sympathized strongly with Machen. I remember there was hearing a story about a wife of one ministerial member who didn't leave for the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and she said her husband told her it's very difficult to work for one church and pray for another. That was the dilemma many found themselves in.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
Um, now, to add insult to injury, the Northern Church, the mainline church, let me back up a second. A very important episode takes place 6 months after the founding of the OPC, a tragic episode. J. Gresham Machen passes away
Okay.
at the young age of 55. He was in North Dakota helping a struggling mission work of the 6-month-old church. In late December, catches pneumonia and dies in a hospital in North Dakota.
I'll be.
It was a tragic loss that stripped the church of its great leader, and these are God's higher ways. That the church was grieving, but they saw their need to pursue the cause that Machen had led. But the insult to injury I want to point out is that the Northern Church, 3 years after the founding, would threaten legal action against the Presbyterian Church of America because its name was too similar to its name. And the young church determined that it didn't have the financial resources to fight a lengthy legal battle. So in February of 1939, 2.5 years after the founding, is my math right there? Or is that 3.5 years? 2.5 years, I think.
We're liberal arts majors around here, John. We don't do math, so that's
I can't do math on Zoom calls. A special General Assembly is called, and the name is changed to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and that through a series of suggestions that commissioners raised and a process of elimination. There were other names that were considered. The American Presbyterian Church was considered, the North American Presbyterian Church, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church was considered. That's currently a name of another denomination. There are two somewhat humorous, tongue-in-cheek suggestions that were made. One of them was the seceding Presbyterian Church of America. And that may have come from someone with a Southern accent. I don't know.
Right.
And the other name that was surely tongue-in-cheek was the True Presbyterian Church of the World. If we can't be the Presbyterian Church of America, we'll go one better. We'll be the True Presbyterian Church of the World, all 5,000 of us. Well,
one of that, right?
And eventually, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church was the name that prevailed. It's been the name ever since. Lord willing, 11 years from now, we will celebrate our centennial. But it's a name that not everyone was terribly pleased with. It was sort of a compromise winner.
Mm.
It's a mouthful. It's a lot of syllables, but it does emphasize that it is Presbyterian in its ecclesiology, and it is Orthodox. Literally means straight teaching. It's faithful to the Word of God and to the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms. Another interesting piece of Presbyterian trivia is that these curiosities around the founding of the OPC have similarities in the experience of the Presbyterian Church in America. Now, the PCA, as some of your listeners may be familiar with, came out of the Southern Presbyterian Church in 1973. They just celebrated 3 years ago their 50th anniversary. Westminster Seminary, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, was founded 7 years before the founding of the OPC. And that seminary would give direction and leadership to the young, new Presbyterian denomination. And a similar phenomenon happens in the South, where 7 years before the founding of the PCA, Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson is founded.
About that.
Another curious similarity is that the PCA itself had to change its name. When the PCA Church was founded in 1973, its original name was the National Presbyterian Church. A few months later, lawyers from a big congregation outside of Washington, D.C., this big congregation is called the National Presbyterian Church, said, "We want to talk to you about your name."
Okay.
So the PCA decided to change its name. Now, interestingly, they came up with a name very similar to the name the OPC couldn't keep. The only difference being the preposition. Not the OPC was founded as the Presbyterian Church of America. The PCA is the Presbyterian Church in America. And I remember hearing one representative of the PCA saying, "We chose in because we want to be in America, but not of America, just as Christians are in the world, but not of the world." And that makes sense to me. I can see that.
So how many today, how many of all the pea soup splits here that we were talking about, how many different denominations would we say that there are of Presbyterians in the United States?
That's a good question. Maybe one or two were added last week. No, I'm kidding. But it does seem to be a question that changes constantly. There are a lot of micro denominations out there.
Okay. Okay.
But among those,
the prominent ones, how about that?
Yeah, I would say at least a half a dozen to 10. I would say.
Okay.
There's an organization called the North American Presbyterian and Reformed Council.
Okay.
To which the OPC and the PCA are both members, that try to do as many cooperative, ecumenical, joint efforts. They talk to each other annually. They consult. They try to do Sunday school publication, missions work, and other things in as cooperative a way as possible. And they're about there may be up to 10 in that alone. That includes some Korean American congregation, Presbyterian congregations. It includes the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. It includes the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America, yet another denomination that goes back much earlier than the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. They're
Wow.
committed to exclusive psalm singing, which was a tradition among Covenanters from Scotland that
Yeah.
came to the New World, and they still practice that.
So if I were trying to sum it up, if I really didn't, maybe it's not easy to sum up. Maybe you have summed it up, okay? But the way that I always tried to kind of I thought I knew what I was talking about was certainly the folks that are today USA Presbyterians is where you would find the left of center, more subjectivist view of Scripture as kind of part of their core. I think that's it's probably a fair thing enough to say. Is that right?
It is. That's true. Now, within the last 2 decades, what really made the difference is the politics of sexuality,
Okay.
because the mainline church has embraced the ordination of gays and lesbians to ministry.
So when you say mainline, you mean USA.
Correct.
If I'm going to see that, if I'm driving down the street and I'm looking at and look, it's not like Baptists or Methodists have got any corner on being able to have several versions as you're driving down the street, right? I mean, but if I see USA, Presbyterian Church USA, I'm understanding and what you're saying, that's what you're referring to as the mainline Presbyterian Church.
That's correct. And
Okay.
that's a helpful clarification that you asked, Nick, because mainline was the common term used in the mid 20th century for these big denominations, which have been hemorrhaging members ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And if you add up all the so-called sideline churches, that's a
Okay.
term some sociologists have employed.
Okay.
You add up the membership in all the sideline Presbyterian churches, and it would include, in addition to the ones we've already named, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, which is another big conservative denomination. The total membership in all these sideline Presbyterian churches is only barely smaller than the so-called mainline church,
Okay.
mainline Presbyterian Church. The mainline Presbyterian Church is down to 1.1 million, and the sum total of all the sideline churches is close to 1 million.
Okay.
So those terms, mainline and sideline, are really anachronistic anymore.
And what would it be for the current version of PCA and or Orthodox?
The numbers of those churches?
Numbers of those churches,
Yeah.
roughly.
The PCA is around 400,000.
Okay.
And the OPC is about 35,000. So the PCA is over 10 times the size of the OPC.
Okay.
And there's interesting reasons for that. The PCA was founded from the Southern Presbyterian Church, and it was a renewal movement that took many years to kind of slow cook.
Mm-hmm.
And it had time to galvanize and build up a larger constituency. The controversy in the Northern Church, by contrast, got so hot so quickly. The exodus happened before Machen and others could build up a larger coalition.
Okay. Okay.
So the PCA is bigger, and it's also more diverse theologically.
Okay.
The OPC is smaller and more united theologically. I want to be careful about that, using that language. More tightly knit, I would say.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Sure. They understand each other on a maybe a tighter, closer connection about
right.
theological things. Like we don't have to even argue about that. That we know where we are. Okay, let's move
right,
on.
and that's largely a function of scale.
Mm.
The smaller you are, the more.
Sure. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, the more,
Yeah.
the more
The
tightly knit
fewer
you
cooks in the kitchen, we don't have to worry about we don't have to
That's
worry
right.
about the broth going the wrong direction. I tell
But
you,
let
this
me,
is such an interesting conversation and thought process about all of the because some people who maybe grew up or are a part of another denomination won't necessarily understand all these pieces, and quite frankly, a lot of people who maybe are new to Christianity as a whole, maybe they haven't grown up or been around any particular denomination. There's when they see things like this, and I'm slightly preaching now, okay, instead of but when they see this or they see the different Baptist denominations or they see the way that there's these different Methodist denominations or they see some of this, it really confuses them all to go, what the heck? I mean, why can't you all just be Christian? I mean, I mean, I understand if you're not, Buddhist, okay? I mean, that's totally a different religion, okay? But why in the world do we have to kind of do it all this way? This is so confusing. This is, and so it just seems to me, and I would be interested to know in your background as a professor of church history, it really seems like doctrine and theology really are those core component pieces that really kind of, as it gets tighter and more defined and easier understood, or other factors come in like gender or other things that would make you have to think about it in a way you hadn't normally thought about it. It really is almost kind of like it galvanizes it more into a more specificity than maybe getting a little bit broader. I know that was a long statement than it was a question, but
right. A lot of sociology of religion divides American denominations in terms of class structure. And there's some truth to that. But I think that the story of conservative Presbyterianism in America shows, um, highlights your point that theology does shape practice. And these things do matter for the life and health of a congregation. We believe these things and we practice these things. And for some Presbyterians, it involves things that other evangelical Christians might scratch their heads about,
mhm,
like Sabbath keeping. We have um, commitments to this sort of thing as a way of um, of showing our um, dissatisfaction with this life and our hope for the life to come, if you will. I think it's really helpful. The OPC at its best, and I use that qualifier because the OPC, like any denomination, is going to be inconsistent in its witness.
mhm,
But at its best, the OPC tries. I think it reveals the lesson Machen learned in his life. Machen was born in an upper class Baltimore family. He went to the best of schools. He went to Johns Hopkins University. He went to Princeton Seminary. Uh, he went from birth in the upper class of Baltimore to death on the frozen plains of North Dakota. He went from bucolic Princeton Seminary to impoverished Westminster Seminary. He went from mainline Presbyterianism to microscopic Presbyterianism. And I say all that because in any human measurement, it was a tragic life,
mhm,
a life of descending humiliation and marginalization. But Machen understood that, to put it in biblical terms, um, when you lose your life, you gain your life.
mhm.
And Machen understood the preciousness of the life to come. And I want to quote something that I think really captures Machen's passion towards the end of his life. This was 5 years before he died. This is an address he gave to the graduates, the first graduating class at Westminster Seminary.
Okay.
So the OPC is not founded yet, but he says these words in May of 1931. He says this to these graduating students about to go out and serve in churches. Remember this at least, he says. The things in which the world is now interested are things that are seen, but the things that are seen are temporal, and the things that are not seen are eternal. You, as ministers of Christ, are called to deal with the unseen things. You are stewards of the mysteries of God. You alone can lead men by the proclamation of God's word out of the crash and jazz and noise and rattle and smoke of this weary age into the green pastures and beside the still waters. You alone, as ministers of reconciliation, can give what the world with all its boasting and pride can never give: the infinite sweetness of the communion of the redeemed soul with the living God. Okay, there I'm preaching, or rather I'm letting Machen preach.
That's all right.
But I do think that that captures
Sure.
the passion of Machen, and at its best, it captures what the OPC sees as its identity: to be a witness to this life of communion with God.
Wow. What a great time to learn about so many of these components and pieces and parts. That's why we do the podcast. That's why we do. That's why we have the Center for Christian History, is because we want people to be able to learn about these things and understand these things, whether that's a denomination that you hang out with or one that you would not, whichever way that might be, to know that this is kind of what you're getting into when you walk into that door, right? So you get an idea about what that's all about. Hey, John Muether, thank you so much for taking time with us to share great information about the founding of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and giving us insight into some other Presbyterian things about what all that is involved there. Thanks so much for doing that.
Well, thank you so much for the privilege. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. It's probably like my wife has often said, "I'm so glad you get that stuff out of your system before you come home, so I don't have to hear about it." So that would be part of it too. Hey, we hope everybody enjoys our podcast and is enjoying as well. Don't forget, we have each month we have our Christian History Chronicles, where we do some good deep dives on things that were important to Christian history. Be sure to go and check out our website and learn about more resources that are available there as well to help you be able to dig even deeper into all things Christian history. Thanks.